أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. أما بعد, our dear brothers and sisters, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, tonight and tomorrow night, I'd like to talk about principles of decision making from the Quran. Because making decisions is an important part of our individual and an important part of our family lives. And we make decisions every day. Some of these decisions are minor decisions, but some of these decisions are very important decisions, important because of their implications upon our lives, and important because of their implications upon those who are around us. Some of these decisions that we make only have an impact upon us, but some of these decisions that we make have an impact upon our family, and sometimes they have an impact upon the community as well. And we make decisions at an individual capacity, and we also make decisions in a collective capacity as well. We make decisions within the family, we make decisions within a committee, and sometimes we make decisions within a community. When decisions are made at a collective capacity, decision-making can be an opportunity for us to bring the family together. Decision-making can be an opportunity for us to unite the family and to include everyone in the decision-making process. Or decision-making can also lead to conflict within the family if decisions are not made properly. Decision-making can also lead to alienating members of the family, or sometimes members of a committee, and sometimes members of a community. So today the question we're asking is, what are the principles of decision-making from the Quran? Does the Quran have any guidance to give us in this area? Because we do use the Quran to make decisions, but we only come to the Quran once our principles have failed, and we do an istikhara from the Quran. And what I want to say today is that we should go beyond having a mysterious relationship with the Quran. We tend to have a very mysterious relationship with the Quran. Even though we don't call it a mysterious relationship, we call it a very spiritual relationship. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we cannot make a decision, we come to the Quran, and mysteriously the Quran guides our decisions, right? For example, when somebody is sick, we recite certain verses of the Quran, and mysteriously that person is supposed to find a cure. Somebody has passed away, we recite surahs of the Quran, and this is good. I'm not saying that there is something wrong with this. What I am saying is that we need to go beyond a mysterious relationship, and we need to start developing a meaningful relationship with the Quran, an intellectual engagement with the Quran, inshallah. Because the Quran has guiding principles for each and every aspect of our lives. And it goes back to our definition of what is religiosity. We should not have a very narrow definition of religiosity. Our definition of religiosity also impacts our expectation from the Quran. It also impacts our expectation from the religion as well. What do I mean by a narrow definition? I mean that sometimes we may think that religiosity is to have a long beard. Religiosity is to pray many prayers. Religiosity is to recite the Quran. Religiosity is to fast. But beyond that, it's not religiosity. When you look at the Prophet of Allah, he defined religiosity very differently. He made each and every aspect of our lives a part of religiosity. For example, it is reported that he would say, "An-nidafatu min al-iman." Cleanliness is part of faith. Meaning, leading and having a clean life, being clean in your life, that is also part of religiosity. The Prophet of Allah used to say, إِذَا عَمِلَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلْيُتْقِنْ. When one of you does any work, let him do it properly, let him do it firmly, let him do it professionally. Being professional in our work is part of religiosity. In some of the hadith, it is reported to have said that patience or perseverance is a part of faith. Being religious also means to be patient and to be persevering in life as well. Now that's a much broader definition of religiosity. Sometimes our definition of religiosity is limited. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a brother once, and he said to me that in our community, he came from outside my community, he said that in our community, we used to have the Sunday school outside the community. We didn't have classrooms within the community, so we rented classrooms outside the community. We rented a school where they had tables, they had chairs, they had a whiteboard, where the classes were separated, they weren't disturbing each other. After a while, we made the decision to leave the school and come back to the center. I said, why, brother? Why did you make that decision? Because when you come back to the center, you're not going to have tables, you're not going to have chairs, you're not going to have whiteboards, you're not going to have partitions that, separate one class from another. They will be disturbing each other. And he said to me, because when we came back to the center, it was a more religious environment. I said, what do you mean by a religious environment? He said, well, when you come into the center, it's the masjid, you've got Arabic calligraphy around you, you've got the pulpit near you, you've got Quran around you. It's a very religious surrounding. I said, subhanallah, look at our definition of religion and religiosity. Religious place, even though a place is not conducive to education and learning, it has become a religious place. And a place which is conducive to education and learning is no longer a religiously conducive place. SubhanAllah. Our definition of religiosity definitely needs to expand. And when we do that, our expectation from the faith changes as well. Our expectation from the Quran changes as well. Then we don't only go to the Quran for guidance on prayers and fasting and zakat and khums. When we come to the Quran, we come to the Quran for guidance on our daily lives as well. And we come to the Quran and we ask the Quran, what are the principles of decision making from the Quran as well? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now there are steps to decision making. And one of the persons who actually worked on this was a man by the name of Simon Hebert. And he lived in the 20th century. And he worked on decision-making within an organization and decision-making within a company. And he developed a very simple model for decision-making. Now I'm taking this model because this model is going to give us a platform for us to talk about the principles of the Quran. And he defined a decision to be something very simple. He said a decision is a choice that you make between the alternatives that you have directed towards a particular objective or goal that you have. That works for a person, it works for a family, it works for a company, it works for a community as well. It's a choice that you make between alternatives that you have directed towards a particular goal. And he came up with a very simple process. He said there are 3 steps in the decision-making process. Step number 1, he said, was intelligence gathering information. Step number 2, analyzing the information. Understanding the risks and the benefits associated to each alternative that you have. And the 3rd step, which turns out to be the most difficult step, is making the decision, choosing one of those alternatives. Now, the first step he said was intelligence gathering. We ought to gather information, we ought to acquire knowledge before we make a decision. And there's a beautiful example in the Quran that illustrates this. This example from the Quran teaches us that when we make a decision, we should first acquire information before making a decision. But more importantly, when we make a decision in the community or in the family, we should make a decision that is based on knowledge, ilm, and not based on assumptions, dhann. Now this example is the example of Prophet Sulaiman. Prophet Sulaiman and Bilqis, the queen of Saba. We're told that one day Prophet Sulaiman was seated in his court and all of his important subjects were there except for one subject that was missing. Hudhud, the bird, was missing. And as you know, Prophet Sulaiman had the ability to talk to the animals. So he says, مَالِي أَلَّا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدْ أَمْ كَانَ مِنَ الْغَائِبِينَ. Why is it that I don't see Hudhud today? Is he absent today? Because if he is absent today, I shall punish him severely. So after a while, Hudhud shows up. And he says, أَحُطُّ بِمَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ وَجِئْتُكَ مِنْ سَبَإٍ بِنَبَإٍ يَقِينٍ. I know something that you don't know. And I bring for you some news from the land of Saba. What did you see over there? I saw إِنِّي وَجَدْتُ امْرَأَةً تَمْلِكُهُمْ وَلَهَا عَرْشٌ عَظِيمٌ. إِنِّي وَجَدْتُ امْرَأَةً تَمْلِكُهُمْ وَأُوتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَلَهَا عَرْشٌ عَظِيمٌ. I saw a woman leading over them, and they have been blessed with many things, and she has a magnificent throne. But there is a problem. وَجَدْتُهَا وَقَوْمَهَا يَسْجُدُونَ لِلشَّمْسِ مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ. I saw her and her community, they were prostrating to the sun and worshipping the sun instead of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he tells a story to Prophet Sulaiman. Prophet Sulaiman doesn't buy the story. He says, I hope this is not an excuse that you are making. And we're going to test this. I'm going to give you a letter, and you have to take this letter to the land of Saba and drop the letter and then go to a distance and look at what they do after they receive the letter. So when they receive the letter, they give it to their queen. The queen opens up the letter. When she reads the contents of the letter, she calls her advisors. When they all gather, she says to them that today I have received a very honorable letter. إِنَّهُ مِن سُلَيْمَانَ. It is from Sulaiman. وَإِنَّهُ. And it is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is one of those places in the Quran, the only surah in the Quran that contains Bismillah inside that surah. And it also has a very important message for us. Whenever we write a letter, or even if we write an email, we should try to begin our emails with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim or Bismillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Innahu min Sulaiman. Certainly it is from Sulaiman. Innahu Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allah ta'alu alayya. Do not exalt yourself in my presence. Wa'tuni muslimin. And come submittingly to me. Now, this is the content of the letter. I never make a decision without seeking advice from you. What is your advice? The advisors were there, without gathering information, without gathering intelligence, right away they turn back to her and they say to her, قَالُوا نَحْنُ أُولُ قُوَّةٍ وَأُولُ بَأْسٍ شَدِيدٍ. We are a powerful nation. We are a strong nation. We can defend ourselves. We can attack if you need us to attack the army of Sulaiman. But she's a smart lady. Her example is there in the Quran because Bilqis is a smart lady. She says, how can you make this decision? You're making assumptions. You don't even have data in front of you. You don't even know how big the army of Sulaiman is. You don't even know how powerful Sulaiman is. What if he is more powerful than us and he comes and utterly destroys us? She says, إِنَّ الْمُلُوكَ إِذَا دَخَلُوا قَرْيَةً أَفَسَدُوهَا وَجَعَلُوا أَعِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً. But don't you know, when kings enter a country, when kings enter a city, they completely rampage in that city. They completely destroy the city. And they make the nobles of the city become the humiliated people in the city. And that's what kings do. Instead, what I suggest, says Bilqis, وَإِنِّي مُرْسِلَةٌ إِلَيْهِمْ بِهَدِيَّةٍ فَنَاظَرَةٌ بِمَا يَرْجُعُ الْمُرْسَلُونَ. I decide that we send him a gift. Let us test him. Is he indeed a prophet of God as he claims to be? Or is he just another regular king? And the messengers that we sent, they are going to gather intelligence and information for us. And she told them, when you go there, tell me the size of Sulaiman's army. Tell me how big is his kingdom. Imagine that. Her advisors were willing to go to war against Sulaiman. Who was Sulaiman? Sulaiman, whose army included the animals. Sulaiman, whose army included the jinn. Sulaiman, whose army had cutting-edge technology at that time. That's what happens when we make decisions without gathering information. Now it sounds like a pretty simple idea, but you would be surprised how often in our lives we make important decisions without having information in front of us. Sometimes a young lady would come and she would say that after having been married for 6 months to a year, and she would say that I want to have nothing to do with him. He's a horrible person, and you know what, there's nothing good in him. And I say, how can that be? When you got married to him, you must have seen something good in him to make that decision, right? What has happened in 6 months to a year? And she would say that no, actually somebody introduced him to us, and we trusted that person. I accepted the proposal. When he came to our house, he looked like a very good person, so we accepted it. I say, but didn't you go and research? Didn't you ask the people around? Didn't you ask members of his family? Didn't you ask his friends what sort of a person he is before you make such an important decision? Before you just do an istikhara? When we do an istikhara, without doing our research, that istikhara has absolutely no value. But didn't you do research before making this decision? No, we just did an istikhara. Even in the collective sense. Sometimes we make decisions based on anecdotal evidence and not based on statistical evidence. We make decisions based on assumptions and not based on knowledge. And this happens sometimes within the family as well, right? In certain communities I've gone to, it becomes fashionable in that community to own a particular type of house. The house, the residence area to the land area should have a particular ratio. Now when that becomes fashionable and one family buys such a house, then another family is also feeling the pressure to buy that house as well. Even though they don't need that house, they still want to buy that house, right? Now there's nothing wrong in having a spacious house. In fact, in the hadith we are recommended to have a spacious house. But that's not the point of discussion. The point of discussion is decision making. Now this family, when they look at one family that looks happy having bought this house, instead of actually assessing their own financial health, assessing their own needs, they decide, we're going to buy that house as well. And sure enough, they come into financial stress, and nothing is more damaging to the health of a family than financial stress. It exacerbates problems. Problems which were minor yesterday become very big and very significant problems today because of financial stress within the house. So number one, very important before we make a decision for us to acquire and gather intelligence. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The second step, which is a more difficult step in the decision-making process according to Herbert Spencer, is the analysis. Analyzing the pros and cons, understanding the risks and understanding the benefits associated with each alternative that you have over there. And in order to do this, having knowledge is not sufficient. You need something that is more than knowledge. In fact, in Islam, there is something more important than acquiring knowledge. Acquiring knowledge is called talabul ilm. Ilm is knowledge. And we've heard about so many ahadith about the importance of knowledge. Talabul ilm faridatun ala kulli Muslim. Seeking knowledge is important upon every Muslim. It has also been reported that the Prophet of Allah may have said that seeking knowledge is compulsory upon you from the cradle to the grave. Or for example, seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. All right. But there is something that is even more important than seeking knowledge. And that is called developing our intellect. The word for intellect in the Arabic language is aql. And there is a strong focus on the aql in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Do you not use your intellect? أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Do you not intellect? In fact, even when you come to our ahadith, you see there is a greater focus on using the intellect than acquiring knowledge. We have 4 important compilations of hadith. The most important one of them is Al-Kafi. Al-Kafi has 3 sections. The first section is Usul Al-Kafi. In Usul Al-Kafi, the first chapter of that book is called Kitabul Aqli wal Jahli, the book of intellect and jahl. Here jahl does not mean ignorance. Here jahl means foolishness. The book of intellect and foolishness. Intellect is very important. And there are a number of important ahadith over here. One of the ahadith, for example, and it's a very symbolic representation. This is not how the history may have occurred, but it's a symbolic representation. We're told that when Prophet Adam came onto the earth, Angel Jibreel came and brought 3 things for him. He brought him the aql, the intellect. He brought him the deen, faith. And he brought him haya, modesty. And he said to them, God has given you an option to choose one of these three. You choose one and the other two will return back. Prophet Adam, out of those three things, he chose the apple. When he chose the apple, Jibreel was about to take the haya and the deen, modesty and faith away, when they said to him, O Jibreel, God has commanded us, wherever the intellect is, we're supposed to stay with the intellect. What's the message? The message is, if we develop our intellect, religion and modesty will come with it as well. Having intellect, developing it, is very important. In fact, if you look in the Quran, prophets of God, they develop the intellect of their children. Intellect is the ability to analyze. Intellect is the ability to understand. Intellect is not information. Intellect is not data. Intellect is the ability to see the data in a particular context, to understand the value of that data. The best example, one of the good examples we have in the Quran, is the example of Prophet Yusuf. Remember when Prophet Yusuf sees a dream, and he comes running to his father, and he says, Ya abati inni ra'aytu ahada ashara kawkaban, wa shamsa wal qamara ra'aytuhum li sajidin. My dear father, I saw 11 stars, the sun and the moon. I certainly saw them prostrating to me. Now, he's asking for the interpretation from Prophet Yaqub. Look at the answer that Prophet Yaqub gives him. He tells him, Ya bunayya, my dear son. Yusuf is looking for an interpretation. Yaqub is opening up his intellect. He's telling him, Yusuf, the interpretation is important, but in life sometimes there are some things which are even more important. So often in our communities sometimes we pay attention to things which are important, but we forget those things which may be even more important at that time. He tells him, لا تقصص رؤياك على إخوتك فيكيدوا لك كيدا. Don't narrate this dream of yours to your brothers, lest they plot a plot against you. That's the most important thing for now. Now Yusuf is probably wondering in his mind, but they are my brothers. They are my flesh and blood, and they will plot against me. What does Prophet Yaqub say to him? He's opening up his intellect. He's teaching him how to analyze a situation. He tells him, Inna shaytana lil insani aduwwun mubin. Surely Satan or shaitan is a manifest enemy to mankind. Meaning what? Oh Yusuf, don't just look at the players that are on the scene. There are players who are behind the scene as well. Be aware of them. Developing the intellect is very important. And the intellect is not developed by reading books or by listening to lectures. The intellect is developed by thinking, by being forced to think, to do tafakkur. Shaheed Murtaza Bachoo has a wonderful book called Ta'lim wa Tarbiyat, Education and Training. In that book, he narrates a beautiful story. He says that there was a man in one of the villages of Iran, who was a very wise person. And anytime you ask him a question, he would give you a very wise answer to that question. So one day a foreigner went up to him, found him in his village, and asked him some questions. And he got a very wise response from this man. So he asked this man, what's your secret? How did you develop this wisdom? Look at the answer. It's a short answer. And I just want you to see the positive side of the answer. He says to him, I am illiterate, therefore I am thinking. I am illiterate, therefore I am thinking. Right? Now, I'm not saying we need to be literate. What I am saying is we need to be thinking. Data is not thinking. Data is not intellect. Now, when we're making a decision and we want to understand the consequences of the decision, we need to use our aql. But in as much intellect as God has given us, we also have to be humble enough to realize that our intellect cannot understand everything. Our intellect is limited. Sometimes our intellect is overshadowed by our emotions. Sometimes our intellect is overshadowed by our desires. Sometimes our intellect is plagued by fatigue, mental fatigue. Sometimes our intellect has certain mental blocks that we can't see other aspects. So what do we do in this case? In this case, we're told we need to consult with others. We need to make use of the intellect of others. We need to tap in to the collective intellect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this advice even to His own Prophet. In the Battle of Uhud, the Muslims initially were winning the battle. And as they were winning the battle, they left their positions to come and get the spoils of war. And when they did that, the enemy regrouped and they attacked them, and the Muslims lost that battle. And as they lost that battle, they ran away from the battlefield. They were supposed to protect the Holy Prophet. They didn't do that. They fled from the battlefield. The Prophet of Allah survived, and he returned back to Medina. Now, when they returned back to Medina, these people who had fled from the battlefield, they came to the Holy Prophet. And they were full of remorse, they were full of regret. And they came to the Prophet and they asked for forgiveness from the Prophet. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet in the Quran, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ لَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَنْفَرُّ مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. It is out of the mercy of God, O Prophet, that you're so lenient with them. If you had been hard of heart, they would have fled and run away from your presence. Sometimes as leaders in our family, as leaders in our classroom, as leaders in our community, we also have to be very tolerant. We have a beautiful hadith from our first Imam. He says, آلة الرياسة سعة الصدر. The instrument of good leadership is tolerance. Right? So we have to tolerate. People make mistakes, we've got to tolerate. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ. Overlook their mistake and forgive them as well. Now, before the battle of Uhud, the Prophet of Allah actually brought his companions together and he said to them, advise me. The army is coming and attacking us. Should we defend ourselves within the city or should we go out of the city? And the majority opinion at that time was that we should go and defend ourselves out of the city. And the Prophet of Allah went with the majority opinion. Now, when they went outside the city, they didn't win the battle. So there was a possibility the next time there's a decision to be made in the community, the Prophet of Allah may tell his companions, this time I'm making the decision by myself. So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell the Prophet? He tells the Prophet of Allah, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Continue to consult them in the affairs of the community. Why? Why should the Prophet of Allah consult them in the affairs of the community? The Prophet of Allah receives divine guidance. He can make the decision by himself. No, the Prophet of Allah wanted them to feel a part of the community. He wanted them to take ownership of the decision that was being made. He wanted to engage them in the community. He wanted them to give a sense of belonging into the community. Right? And that's what we need to do within our families as well. It may be my right to make the decision, but when I involve everybody in the decision-making process, I give them ownership of the decision. Now they're willing to do it together. It unites the family. It creates a strong family bond within the family as well. So we need to do that within the family for two reasons. The first reason is we need to do that to create a strong family spirit. The second reason why we need to do that is also because our intellect is limited. And we need to be humble enough to realize that. When we go and we seek advice from others, in our books of hadith, this is known as istikhara. And this can be known as istikhara as well. Istikhara is a process of decision making. And one of the processes in the decision making is seeking advice from others. So let me share one hadith with you and we'll end the discussion for today. One of our Imams, I believe it's the sixth Imam, Imam al-Sadiq, alayhi afdalu salati wa salam. It is reported that he said, إِذَا أَرَادَ أَحَدُكُمْ أَمْرًا فَلَا يُشَاوِرُ فِيهِ أَحَدًا مِنَ النَّاسِ حَتَّى يَبْدَأَ فَيُشَاوِرُ اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى. When one of you wants to consult other people in a decision that you want to make, then don't consult with them until you have consulted with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do you consult with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The Imam says, you do istikhara. Meaning what? Meaning you say, astaghfirullah. I seek goodness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My Lord, I'm going to make a decision. I'm looking for the right decision to make. I'm going to consult this person. Oh Allah, help me find the right decision in consulting this person. The meaning of istikhara is dua. You make a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once you make the dua, then the Imam says, go and consult that person. Insha'Allah, the answer that you need, God will make it flow on the tongue of His servant. That's an istikhara as well. So that's the second process in the decision-making process, to understand the choices that we have and the consequence of each alternative that we have. And the last process, the most difficult step in the decision-making process, is to actually make the decision. And that sometimes can be very hard because we face many challenges when it comes to finally making a decision. We're going to be talking about that tomorrow night, inshallah. If you recite the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In the second part of the discussion for tonight, as we mentioned last night, I'll be talking about some of the rulings of the congregational prayer. As you know, Salatul Jama'ah is highly recommended within our faith. In fact, our first Imam, right after the death of the Holy Prophet, he had made a promise that he would not leave the house for any reason, because he was going to stay home and he was going to write down the Quran on one scroll and in one book. And for no reason would he leave the house. When somebody asked him to come out of the house, the Imam said to him, I have made a promise to myself and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I shall not leave my house for any reason, and I will only put on my abba for the sake of prayers. Meaning what? For the sake of going to the mosque and offering the congregational prayers. If Ali could have avoided that, he would have avoided that as well. But he didn't do that, because that was something that was very important to him. The second point I want to make is that congregational prayer can even happen between two people. There's no condition that there have to be 3 or 5 people. In Salatul Jum'ah, you have to have 5 people, 4 people, and the Imam. In Salatul Jama'ah, any other Jama'ah, even 2 people can make a Jama'ah. There was a companion of the Holy Prophet, he said to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, I don't live in the city, I live outside the city, and sometimes when I'm outside the city, it's only me and my wife. Can me and my wife have Salatul Jama'ah? And the Prophet of Allah said to him, yes, you and your wife can have Salatul Jama'ah as well. Now when you do that, the one who's leading is known as the Imam, and the one who's following is known as the Ma'moom. Okay? The third point I want to make is that once a person becomes the Imam, he assumes certain responsibilities. The first responsibility that he assumes is that he recites Surah Al-Fatiha and he recites the second surah in the first and the second rak'ah. Meaning what? Meaning the Ma'moom should not and cannot recite Surah Al-Fatiha and the second surah when he is praying in Jama'ah. Everything else the Ma'moom has to recite. All the other dhikr he has to recite. In the third and fourth rak'ah, the tasbihat he has got to recite. But in the first and second rak'ah, when the Imam is reciting the first surah and the second surah, the Ma'moom is not supposed to be reciting it. Fourth point is that the Imam is known as the Imam because he is the leader, meaning he leads the actions. Therefore, the Ma'moom should not precede him in actions. The Ma'moom should not enter sujood before the Imam has entered sujood. The Ma'moom should not enter the ruku before the Imam has entered the ruku. Sometimes I tell my community, it's not a race that I and you are having. You don't have to race into the ruku, you don't have to race into the sujood. But the Ma'moom can precede the Imam in recitation. So for example, you're reciting tashahhud, if you get ahead of the Imam in the recitation, that is okay. The fifth point that I want to make, and that'll be the last point that I make, is that in Salatul Jama'ah, we need to have a connection. Connection is very important. The Prophet of Allah wanted the believers to stand in straight lines. He wanted them to stand next to each other. He would tell them, stand shoulder to shoulder, for example, right? So connection is very important. How do I achieve connection? I achieve connection from the front. I achieve connection from the right. I achieve connection from the left. But I do not achieve connection from behind. Okay, one. Secondly, I do not achieve connection from someone who's very far away from me. If the person who's in front of me is far away from me at a distance that is more than one very long step, right? Let's say he's 2 meters ahead of me, I don't get connection from him. The person to my right or the person to my left, if their distance away from me is more than one very long step, let's say they're 2 meters away from me, I don't get connection from them. Thirdly, I don't get connection from the person who is in front of me or the person who is to my right or to my left if there is an obstacle between me and that person. An obstacle like what? An obstacle like a very big pillar. An obstacle like what? an obstacle like a young child who is not mumayyiz. There's a misconception that the child has to be baligh. The child does not have to be baligh. The child has to be mumayyiz. Meaning what? Meaning that sometimes you might have a young boy who's 12 years of age, and he's not baligh, but he understands the prayer. He understands that he's standing in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He understands the qiyam, he understands ruku, he understands sujood. He's capable of praying the prayer properly, but he's not baligh. Such a boy, does he offer connection or not? The answer is yes, he does. Okay? So he has to be mumayyiz, does not necessarily have to be baligh. The last point that I haven't covered today is, let's say if I'm late to join the jama'ah, am I able to join the jama'ah? Let's say I enter and the imam is in the second surah, or I enter and the imam is in the ruku. Am I able to join? The answer is, well, yes, I'm able to join, but there are particular laws pertaining to that which I will cover tomorrow night, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.